The guiding theme of this year's World Wildlife Day is sustaining all life on Earth. This broad focus champions the importance of preserving and protecting the richness of biodiversity, but it is also inclusive of human relationships with nature, recognizing the need to balance conservation and sustainable use of wild animals and plants, whilst protecting and improving people's livelihoods and well-being. This bigger picture goal of sustaining all life could not come at a more critical time. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, has determined that achieving international sustainable development targets, as well as nature conservation and climate change goals, is not achievable under the current business-as-usual system, and transformative, system-wide changes are needed if we are to achieve nature-friendly climate adaptation and environmental objectives. Of an estimated 8 million species on this planet, it is thought that around 1 million are threatened with extinction, many of them within decades unless action is taken now. And of just under 6 million terrestrial species, around 500,000 do not have enough habitat for long-term survival. And 35% of marine species are thought to be in decline. My research at Northumbria University is centred around the issue of sustainable use of wildlife. I'm particularly interested in how we decide which species we value for conservation and which species can be exploited, sustainably or otherwise. During this presentation, I will be looking a little deeper at this issue of sustainable use and question how effectively different wildlife are protected and sustained. Firstly, how can we protect all life on Earth from unsustainable levels of exploitation if we do not have a clear picture of what is threatened and what is being exploited? Although the true scale of wildlife crime is not known, it is estimated to be worth in the region of 7 to 23 billion US dollars per year. Illegal trade includes numerous wildlife, from exotic pets and furs, to wildlife-derived medicines, food, ornaments, and rare plants. However, when we include the value of illegal logging, which is believed to contribute between 15 and 30% of the global timber trade, and has an estimated value of between 51 and 152 billion US dollars annually, as well as the value of illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, the scale of which is thought to represent 1 in every 5 fish caught, which is equivalent to between 11 and 26 million tons of fish, which, for perspective, corresponds to 433,000 African elephants. IUU fishing is valued at between 11 and 24 billion US dollars per year. These combined trades increases the value of the illicit wildlife trade to an estimated 69 to 199 billion US dollars per year. Now, whilst the illegal wildlife trade receives a lot of attention, it's important to be aware of the scale of the legal trade in wildlife. The legal wildlife trade is estimated to be worth approximately 323 billion US dollars per year, with around 100 billion of this destined for European markets. It's important to recognise, however, that 90% of all legal trade in wildlife is made up of either timber, in its processed or unprocessed form, and fish, supplying the world with all we can eat from our oceans. However, the overlap between legal markets and illegal suppliers is a murky one. By today's best estimates, the legal trade in wildlife far outnumbers the illegal wildlife trade. So, how do we decide what is legal and what is illegal when it comes to wildlife trade? This leads me to CITES. CITES is the Convention on International Trade in endangered species of wild fauna and flora, and it should provide a mechanism for transparent and sustainable trade in wildlife. Through sanctioning and prohibiting certain forms of wildlife commodification, CITES defines the legal parameters for international wildlife trade. It operates by categorizing wildlife into 3 appendices based on how threatened each species is by trade. In total, CITES lists just over 37,000 species, and just over 80% of these are plants. The species groups featured and the levels of protection given gives an insight into how different wildlife are exploited and commodified, and which species are prioritised when it comes to conservation or to trade. The diversity of wildlife impacted by trade can be seen when breaking down the appendices by species. Appendix 1 offers the highest level of protection for species whose survival is directly threatened by trade. In most instances, international trade here is banned. Mammals and plants are heavily featured on Appendix 1, but overall less species groups are represented. Appendix 2 contains species that could become threatened by trade. Wildlife on this list should be more closely managed, and quotas on the quantity of wildlife and wildlife products allowed to be traded may be set, and export permits are required to trade internationally. 95% of all CITES listings are on Appendix 2, highlighting the Convention's overarching goal of sustainably managing wildlife trade while prohibiting only the most seriously threatened and unsustainable forms of trade. Interestingly, a greater number of birds, reptiles, and corals are listed on Appendix 2 compared to mammals. Appendix 3 is more of a precautionary appendix. Species may be listed here when a range country becomes concerned about the impacts of trade or a species' survivability and needs additional support to monitor levels of international trade in that species. So back to the theme of this year's Wildlife Day, sustaining all life. Sustaining all life requires comprehensive and rapid responses when a species becomes threatened. However, in formulating CITES regulations, not all voices nor all species are equal, and many threatened species, particularly timber and fish, are not listed on CITES despite being threatened by trade. In a study comparing the IUCN Red List of threatened species and CITES species listings, around 28% of threatened internationally traded species were not also receiving CITES protection. And it took an average of 10.3 years for an IUCN assessment which recognised the risks associated with international trade to then be included within CITES appendices. An area that is significantly affected in this regard is the ocean. Despite covering over 70% of the Earth's surface and containing some of the most biodiverse habitats in the world, only around 6% of species listed in CITES are marine wildlife. The majority of these are marine invertebrates, including sea anemones, corals, and jellyfish. Now, although many whales, dolphins, turtles, sharks, and corals do receive protection from CITES, many commercially exploited marine fish species are not included on the lists, despite dwindling stocks and high levels of exploitation. Seafood is a hugely valuable commodity and provides around 3.1 billion people with 20% of their animal protein, and just under 60 million people rely on fisheries and agriculture as their main employment. But considering the decline in many commercially important fish species and the scale of both legal and illegal fishing, it seems that more can be done to protect and sustain life in our oceans, especially as the popularity of eating fish is increasing worldwide. On average, people consume around 34 calories of fish per day. However, in countries with a high preference for fish, like Iceland, Japan, Spain, and Portugal, as much as 130 calories of fish can be consumed per person per day. In terms of the weight of fish consumed, habits also vary globally. Europeans eat an average of 22.5 kilograms of fish per person per year. In North America, it's around 21 kilograms, whereas in Asia, an average of 24 kilograms of fish is eaten per person per year. And in China specifically, the value is much higher at 41 kilograms per person per year. However, currently, 33% of fish stocks are considered to be overexploited, and around 55% of the ocean is industrially fished. Here I have touched on the significance and scale of marine wildlife exploitation. Sustaining all life will be a delicate balance, but it is critical that we recognise the many ways in which wildlife is under threat, and how support systems need to improve their effectiveness in recognising and responding to the harms and crimes towards wildlife and the natural environment. The sheer scale of wildlife affected by human activities is not reflected in the economic valuations of the legal and illegal wildlife trades, as each involves the removal and killing of millions upon millions of individual wildlife, that in turn are part of a greater ecological whole whose value is immeasurable. If we are truly invested in sustaining all wildlife, that needs to include a reflection of the everyday and normalised wildlife trade across all species groups. Thank you for listening. If you found this video interesting and would like to contribute to my research, please consider taking this survey on marine wildlife consumption. Thank you for your time.